excited to be here with you today. The topic for today's conversation is legal data architecture. Before we hop into all that good content, I know Colin mentioned that Peter and I both represent EY Law. We are employed by EY Law, and consequently, before we deliver any sort of presentation or conversation like the one today, we have to be sure that we put forward the appropriate disclaimers. So I suspect that you all know that the intent of today's conversation is to be educational, just a nice chat amongst friends. Nothing that we discuss here today should be relied upon in any way, and should not necessarily be viewed as a perspective of EY Law or EY LLP. Okay. Moving on then to the topic again, and I think that the goals or high level conversation that we anticipate having. I know for me in my role at EY Law, we come across a lot of clients that are contemplating legal data architecture strategies, right? They want to implement a new CLM tool, they want to implement a new matter management tool, and they go forward with those efforts without that broader strategy to guide their implementation of those tools. And I don't think that this is an easy problem to solve, right? We all want to implement these tools to optimize our legal department functions, make things move faster, better, cheaper. But getting that data architecture strategy in place is really so critical to success for these technology implementations. So that's what we plan to talk about today. Certainly our goal is to help guide you and your teams as you contemplate these decisions and really help to reinforce the value of that data architecture strategy as you look to different tech solutions in the upcoming months, or short or long term. So with that, our agenda, I think, we'll obviously talk about where you start this journey. Why do we care about legal data? What can it do for us? What are the opportunities that we can really capitalize on if we do a good job with creating that architecture strategy? And then we'll move on to focusing in and looking at some of the more traditional ways that people have kind of defined success in implementing these different tools within the corporate legal function, but then new ways of assessing what success should look like going forward, and really taking your tech strategy to that next level beyond what we've known for the past 5 or 10 years. So we'll spend about 30 minutes covering those topics, and then I think we have 15 minutes reserved at the end of today's session for Q&A. I am Christine Sands. I think Colin introduced me. I am with EY Law. I'm a manager as part of the legal function consulting practice. I have roughly 15, probably closer to 20, I hate to say now, years of experience in the legal operations space. I've been on both the client side and the firm side. I've held a variety of roles, and I think that's really helped to shape me and bring me to where I am today as a consultant with the EY legal function consulting practice. I really think that I can bring that value to clients, having had all those different perspectives, spend time in-house, driving a multinational, legal program. So, and also I've spent a lot of time looking at different technology options, implemented a couple of matter management systems myself. So yeah, lots of different experience that I can call upon to help guide today's conversation, but nothing in comparison to my partner here, Peter Krakauer, who I'll let him introduce himself because I couldn't do him justice.
Thank you, Christine. As Colin mentioned, I'm EY's Global Law Innovation and Technology Leader. About 30 years experience from every aspect of legal service delivery as a lawyer in large law, to of counsel chief knowledge officer in large law, to in-house director of legal ops to working at an alternative service provider, and now in the Big Four. And a lot of what we'll talk about today is Christine suggested, it's really focusing on the data and not the technology. We try and distinguish the two. I've worked for years in various enterprises with Christine. She has a wealth of knowledge around spend management and the data around spend. And so to me, it's not a matter management system. It's like, how are you capturing and using, and what kind of data do you need? And so she'll have some comments later on, but really looking forward to the conversation today, the nature of these virtual environments. So we'd like to be as collaborative as possible. We have a lot to get through. We will reserve 15 minutes towards the end for questions. Feel free to use the chat if there's things that, as we're going through, there's a concept or question you have around it. We may defer it towards later if we can, but don't want to move beyond concepts, if there's still lingering questions out there. So feel free to tee up the questions. So starting the journey around data and why you care about data. And so what you see here and some of the concepts throughout this presentation that you'll have access to afterwards is a mixture of sort of more traditional data architecture concepts, a mixture of concepts that are maybe terms of arts from AI and technology sort of strategies, if you will, but really try to translate some of the conversation here from not sort of saying, here's how you go about in creating them, but trying to help knit together the bigger picture of why we're talking about data and data architecture. And then, as Christina alluded to in the agenda, giving you some concrete examples. But I think we're all familiar with sort of the landscape right now. We're drowning in data. Everybody's talking about the need for big data and recognizing there's structured, unstructured data. But as you start looking at the challenges of today, we're drowning in data. Importantly, data is particularly in legal. It's in silos. So you're typically going to sort of create and implement a system, call it a matter management system, call it a document management system, name your flavor, but you're creating the data structure for that system. And that's the challenge. That's why we're drowning in data, because we have all these disparate systems. And so from a legal perspective, from an enterprise perspective, the challenge is we've otherwise architected data for fit for purpose for one particular system, but the way you're naming a client in a matter management system may be different than the way you're naming or classifying a client in a document management system or a contract management system or an enterprise relationship management system, and thus the silos. This has an impact on innovation. We're constantly changing, and the technology needs and use cases of today are accelerating for tomorrow. And if you're the side effect of having all these data silos is you're not going to be able to innovate. And so, it is a blocker for many enterprises, for many initiatives, if you haven't thought about the data in a bigger picture architectural perspective of really how you're going to go forward from, call it innovation, call it digitization of the practice or business of law. We all recognize that technology is changing. So the black box solution today, there's going to be another one tomorrow that promises even better and more. And then data entropy is sort of a concept of just disorder and randomness. There's if you start looking at the data you have, whether it's structured or unstructured, there's a lot of duplication, a lot of randomness that ultimately is going to start impacting your ability to drive performance, call it AI, call it not, as well as deriving insights from the data you're collecting across your entire ecosystem. And so if that's where we're today, how does it look, for tomorrow about why you should care? Again, fit for purpose. I'm not going to go through every talking point here, really trying to lay the foundation, and it would encourage you to look at these materials, but you're really trying to think in a bigger picture about data. It needs to be fit for purposes of where your business is going and where you want to go, not only today, but tomorrow. It needs to be intentional. It needs to be scalable, elastically scalable, if you really want to get into some more data data-driven kinds of concepts and terms. And you need to sort of manage the evolution of your data strategy and your technology and innovation strategy by decoupling your data strategy from those siloed technology decisions. And that's difficult because you've got things in flight or you have systems in use. And so you're trying to re-architect a broader vision, but you can't disrupt the cart that's already in place. But ultimately, if the challenge we have in terms of truly AI enabling, and I'll just leave that term without qualifying it, from the entropy state, you're trying to create a little bit more order with your structured and unstructured data to be able to drive true business results. But more importantly, I'd say just tell a story. And if you feel comfortable, you can tell a story with your entire tech stack, both legal and non-legal. Again, from an enterprise perspective, I saved you 25 or 50 minutes of your time. You can move on. Otherwise, let's move on to the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so I think Peter covered a lot of this already, but I think one of the big opportunities in formulating that data architecture strategy is really deciding where your budget is going to go, right? Making informed decisions around technology investments, which I know for most folks in this current climate is really, really difficult and complicated. Budgets are obviously thinner than ever. There are more tools available than ever. And so really being thoughtful about what it is you want to accomplish, specifically what those data points are that you want to capture and the story that you want to tell, to Peter's point, that's going to help guide you in making those technology investments. The second item that you see here, legal is part of the enterprise. I think that gone are the days where legal is just functioning as this separate kind of speak when that's not the right characterization. But I think the expectation more and more is that legal is a very critical component of that broader business enterprise. They have a seat at the table more and more in making business decisions, and having the right data available, telling that story again, is going to be critical to that evolving role within the enterprise. And then this topic of enabling AI delivery, I know everyone has very high hopes around AI. It's certainly a buzzword that we hear frequently as part of our day jobs. Again, data critical to that, right? Just having that very purposeful kind of strategy for where and how you enable AI, that's all going to be driven by that data architecture strategy that we're speaking about today. So you see that the slide as it's laid out, it's all pointing downward, all kind of tracks back to data, which there's the better handle you have on your data strategy, the better equipped you're going to be to manage those data security pressures, to ensure compliance, and then really to have a leg up on the competition, right? And do some really innovative, disruptive things within the corporate legal function.
The one area I'd call out on this slide, which is visually smaller, but probably should be reversed in terms of the size. Mm-hmm. That point that collectively we are, or the audience should be thinking about, you're shifting from data for business reporting to enabling digital process enablement. So you can have a fancy dashboard, but what data is there that's actionable, that's truly going to enable you to transform the way you're delivering it? So AI-enabled delivery, that's just augmenting people and how you're sort of rethinking the way you're delivering, call it service or legal service. And so, data is not there to tell you how good you're doing. Data is there to help you understand how you can transform the way you're doing it. Yeah. And that's the paradigm that people need to start thinking about when you're thinking about legal data and legal data architecture.
Really great point. Really great point. Thank you for calling that out.
Okay. So this is sort of a slide often share in the conversations. I'm a global innovation technology leader. That pyramid at the top is technology. It's usually the last thing I think about, and I'm leading technology. Ultimately, the top two areas are highlighted about data and technology. But I encourage everyone, as you're thinking about data, it's only there to do something. And so start at the bottom, start at the process. What is a legal service portfolio? What are the legal activities you need to do? You need to draft and review NDAs. You need to sort of intake and triage litigation. You need to sort of manage, M&A activity or comply with corporate formalities. Those are the things, the processes you need to do. And if you're starting to think about technology, don't just say, oh, I've got that, now I need a tech enablement. You really need to start thinking about the people. So do I need a lawyer to do it? Do I need a paralegal to do it? A contract manager? Do I need a data scientist? Do I need a project manager? Or do I need a piece of technology that I'll call a person for this purpose? And then from there, you start thinking about your sourcing. How am I going to do it? Is it going to be a law firm? Is it going to be in-house? If it's that instant NDA, maybe it's self-service. So now I just need technology to enable the business, and all the lawyers and all the law firms, managed service providers are out of the picture. Or are you doing it out of a global business center? Are you using someone like EY, which back to Christine's notion earlier about sort of legal's part of the enterprise? Well, the big four are somewhat well positioned and unique in that broader ecosystem of sourcing, in that we don't just sort of support legal, but we're also helping transform HR, IT, finance, tax, et cetera. So, and the commercial team and the R&D team. So as you're thinking about sort of transforming and how all these pieces fit together, that's when I look at this sourcing model. EY is included in there. So are law firms. Everyone has a place in it, but that's where I'm thinking about where I'm getting that talent to deliver those processes. From there, now towards where we're talking about this data layer. What is the data that I need to sort of measure and track and enable all of the foregoing? That's where this data architecture fits in, and it needs to be very intentional about how you're doing it. So ultimately, we'll talk about some of the use cases, but that's where it's critical. And only then, and only then do I start worrying about technology, because there's going to be some technology that can do with it, but it might not get me and report and track all the data that I need to track, or it might not support federation of service delivery and people across that entire ecosystem of law firms, big four managed services, in-house, GDS, legal team. And so if you're taking the technology and saying, I've selected it before thinking all those other things, you may not have a technology stack that's fit for purpose to do all of the below. So let's go to the next piece of it. And so that's sort of the bigger picture. How do you need to think about sort of data? How do you need to think about legal data? How might you approach it from sort of the process all the way up to sort of go towards it? And so it's been a very high level view on what technology and data, how they might be thought about. We haven't given you the roadmap to sort of truly create the data architecture. What we're going to try in the next couple of minutes is really sort of give you some more practical use cases in the legal function to sort of translate that into really things that you might think about today, but think about them differently.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So I love this slide because I think it really captures the evolution of these different facets of the corporate legal function and how they have evolved over the last maybe 3 years specifically. I don't know, but spend analysis, taking that as our first example, I think we've come from a place where just kind of reporting on outside counsel expenses, what firms you're spending with, how much money is going to litigation versus other areas of law. Our needs, our expectations, I think, from spend analysis were very simple. And as highlighted here, transitioning that thought process to look more closely at that overall service delivery unit cost, thinking more critically about spend in general, that is the direction in which we see things heading, right? Contracts is another great example. CLM is not my area of expertise, but I certainly have spent a good bit of time working with contracts, and I've seen, again, this tremendous evolution from just demand and velocity, right? Wanting to understand what the requests are, how quickly are we responding to them, to systems that will optimize templates, track and analyze which templates are being used with what frequency, variations between when a core template is used versus when it's modified to meet a specific client request. So those opportunities are really really significant, and we see more and more clients really looking at CLM as an optimization area within the corporate legal function entity.
And Christine, this is another perfect example of that comment I made earlier about going from reporting to sort of thinking about different ways of delivery. So
Yes.
when you think about contracts, contract life cycle, and yes, you want to report on the demand. Yes, you want to understand your increasing velocity in terms of the throughput the legal team have to enable the business to recognize revenue. But how are you looking at that data to think about not only how you're maintaining, but you're optimizing your templates that drive all of that demand and the velocity and enablement? And so looking at the data less from the bespoke system, but truly trying to think about how you're transforming the way you do it. And so the service delivery unit cost, the template optimization, these other areas are sort of, again, how are you thinking about it from that other perspective?
Yep, absolutely. No, that's a great point. And we get into that in more detail too on one of the upcoming slides. On entity management, again, a tremendous evolution there, along with legal service, moving away from a simple intake tool that routes work to the right resources and ensuring compliance with SLAs, to promoting an environment and a process which allows people to essentially be more self-sufficient, fulfill their own requests to the greatest extent possible, and really drive kind of a whole new way of looking at legal service delivery within a corporate environment. And so I think then the last point on the slide is really considering the art of the possible, right? We talked about structured versus unstructured data and how we can use that to help drive that measurement of unit costs, using data to help predict legal project budgets. I mean, that's definitely a tremendous opportunity, and one that I think people are starting to dabble in, but to some extent, largely uncharted territory as well. And then, using that template data within a CLM tool to help measure risk and modify playbooks and templates as needed to mitigate risk as much as possible.
So sort of focusing on unit cost, again, moving from what is outside counsel today, what is the billing rate for any particular level of attorney in a jurisdiction for a certain kind of work. As you start thinking about, call it outside counsel spend or legal spend management generally, move from the cost of legal services by law firms to the cost of legal services for everyone. So what is the fully loaded cost for all of the timekeepers or all of the attorneys and legal professionals in your legal department? What is the sort of the unit cost that you have for your CLM providers? What are the costs, et cetera, of all these? What's the cost to actually deliver self-service NDAs? That's a different unit cost than it is to have a lawyer review and draft that as a fully loaded cost. So as you start thinking about the purpose of your data, start thinking about it in terms of what are you measuring it for legal? Are you measuring it for the business? Are you measuring for a law firm or by a law firm or provider, or are you trying to do all of the above? As I've suggested as we suggest in this topic, we think you can do it for all of them. And then as you start looking at the data, what are again the units that you're starting to measure it by? Is it by a law firm? Is it by a timekeeper? Is it by a contract? Is it by a robot? Or is it by all of them? And then as you're starting to sort of look at the way you're costing that service delivery, are you looking to add it to, and what's the purpose of your data? Is it to manage spend? Is it to create and manage to a budget? Are you trying to manage behavior? Or are you trying to transform legal service delivery? You could get that. I think it should be all. But the actual data that you have underneath in the tables and the relational tables to do each one of those is going to be different. You're going to have different measures. You're going to have different ways of tracking if you're just trying to manage a budget versus trying to manage overall spend, or if you're trying to change behavior. And then ultimately, if you're trying to transform service delivery. And the same would be said for all of the above. If you're looking at by law firms, by contracts, by robots, the data that you have in that underlying architecture and the relational tables and the way you're sort of tracking data and metadata, the data about the data, which is ultimately where it's more important to focus on. That's where you need to start thinking about the purpose of your data if your goal is, in this case, unit cost for service delivery. So then how do you get there? You might want to work your way backwards or forwards. We're all in current matter management systems looking at hours, looking at rates. Are you looking at fully loaded costs internally, et cetera? As you're starting to think about how you're structuring or restructuring structured data or unstructured data, how are you breaking down those tasks beyond the BMS codes? The question really is as you start looking, for example, at law firm data, it's coming through perhaps with structured existing codes. It's coming in structured data as well as unstructured data. How good are the classifications and the tasks that have been assigned by individual timekeeper? Is it consistent or is it not? Or do you need to, throw more tech at it to reprocess that data and transform that data into something meaningful and that's normalized within a system or across systems? And then again, back to how you might otherwise get there from this architecture perspective, aligning your tasks across subjects and participants to truly start having data that can tell a story. And then there are other flavors that obviously impact how you look at this, whether you're by sector, industry, pharma, financial services, will have different views on that, as well as the individual functions, commercial, R&D, and procurement.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. So going back to that concept around template optimization in the contract management space, I think that we touched on it briefly, but the opportunities to use data there to enable efficiencies across the legal team and partner more closely with the business in particular, I think those are two of the most obvious opportunities that present when thinking about the data that can be used out of a CLM tool to support, again, that proactive way of thinking about things as opposed to reporting. In terms of what you want to capture, obviously capturing the types of contracts that are in flight, the changes that are being made most frequently to your contract templates, and then those levels again of variation and risk. Those are going to be, I think we see those are three of the focus areas that come up consistently when we're working with clients to implement CLM tools and thinking through different ways to optimize the contract management function more broadly. And then using that data again to just think about how can we be doing things better, cheaper, faster, right? Having those insights into the frequency with which you are drafting specific contract templates, the clauses that are being used with frequency, all of that's going to help to drive efficiencies, lower costs, and potentially, to the extent that this is an internal goal, create outsourcing opportunities, however you choose to do it, right? But definitely opportunities to lower costs and create efficiencies across the legal function. So Peter, anything that you would add there?
Yeah, I mean, so let me just, sometimes the story helps. And so everything that you've reviewed here, is a way of thinking, again, in a different way about data and the contracting function. But so when I was supporting sort of the business legal teams in terms of managing templates and managing playbooks, we had a standard process where every month legal would sit down with the business and review both the legal and business terms and understand where the business was going. So did we give, a 15 or a 20-year lease and how would that play out? So that's where the business was going. And then we needed to think about the risks there. But from a practical perspective, from a contract process and in flight. We started in January in 1 year, and we had the templates. And so we had like X number of deals. You can scale it to your business that were in flight, that were negotiated. And let's call it was a 3-month cycle that was typical for the nature of scale of those kinds of agreements. So come March, we've already had 2 more meetings internally about how we're changing our template, and the new template would roll out in March 15th, that would have all those enhancements. But we couldn't go back and renegotiate all the deals that were in flight from January and February. You can't shift the terms that are in real time. And so as you're starting to track data and starting to think about how you're optimizing your templates, you now need to sort of not only think about, oh, my contract lifecycle system needs to be tracking where this current contract is in flight, but I also need to track which template I'm actually using. So I now am knowing that that's a deal that we're putting in the 20-year deal, as opposed to now the new 15-year deal. And so there's a risk there. And now I need to start measuring and tracking which deals I'm now giving 15-year warranties versus 20-year warranties. Mm-hmm. So it's not a risk, it's just a business issue that you need to track. Mm-hmm. And so then when you're talking about how you're optimizing templates, this all goes back into, I'm going to start looking at the terms that were being negotiated versus template 1 versus template 2 versus template 3 over the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. And now I'm going to start thinking about how I'm going to optimize and minimize the business risk, minimize the legal risk as these contracts are evolving. And so you've got, over the course of the year, and let's say you're doing 4 different versions of your template, you've got 4 different sets of data that you're managing on a very superficial level about how you're looking at your contracts, or you're looking at the velocity. And so the velocity, when you've got new business terms and you're doing 20-year deals as opposed to 15-year deals, the market may say, oh, we want that. So they're going to accelerate how that's going to go. So how are you actually thinking about it? You need to have an intentional data architecture to think about this, because if you don't, you're just going to be playing, sort of a kind of a contractual whack-a-mole to truly understand, is it a risk? Are there material business terms or not? And then how am I going to make it smarter and better and faster for the next quarter or the next year?
Yeah, no, that's a great story. That illustrates it perfectly. Thank you. Okay, well then moving on to self-service really quickly.
So in terms of thinking about self-service, and again, back to that pyramid we talked about earlier, and thinking about service delivery and what you're automating. As you're thinking about, and there's a lot of demand that we see in the market, we're trying to create legal help, legal workflow, legal demand portals and systems to track the work, because that's kind of your front door right now to truly start capturing some data about the demand for legal services beyond what is sort of more objectively reported by the team in terms of the volume. You may have the volume in terms of the contracts, but you don't have the volumes for all the Q&A kinds of things for regulatory advice, et cetera. So, some suggestions as you're thinking about creating those legal service or legal demand portals is, how are you even describing the services? Are you describing the way the legal team thinks about it, the way the business thinks about it, the way internal providers think about it? So again, if it's that broader ecosystem of delivery, it's like, I need a contract. What kind of contract? Is it employment? Is it, what are the terms that are being defined in that will speak to the way legal thinks about it? And sometimes it's very different than the way business or other providers think about it. As you start thinking about sort of further structuring the data around your subjects areas, they might be practice-specific data in fields. So what works for a compliance team and the way they're kind of track information is different than the corporates, different than litigation, different than the commercial. And again, as you're starting to think about the classifications that may play out into quote unquote an e-billing or matter management system, how do those play out with the way you're actually tracking it in a legal demand portal? And then should you align all that data across the various subjects, and as well as both the internal and external stakeholders? Sometimes you can, sometimes it's boiling the ocean to try and do all of that. And so you just need to be back to that word intentional, thinking about how you're structuring it. And then if you're looking at self-service, are you auto routing it? Do you have other tables and other rules in place where you have to route the request for legal service to somebody who's going to conduct triage and assign it? And then how is that going to play out, and how are you thinking about the phases both for yourself as well as the business, how you're reporting it from a request to an assignment to the review, perhaps returning that back to the requester, or reassigning it, escalating it, closing it, reopening it. That's just metadata about what you're structuring and how you're presenting the data, but they're all elements that go to the success of this kind of self-service.
Awesome, thank you. And I think, just to build on that, and I'll cruise through these last couple of slides pretty quickly in the interest of time, but I think we alluded to it earlier, this concept of, with any technology, you want to walk before you run, but self-service, is definitely an area where, you can really promote some significant kind of organizational changes, I would say, or process changes in terms of the way things are being done. So, certainly you need to take into consideration the security restrictions that you want to put into place, the audit trail requirements that you would need to think about as part of most systems. But again, like if you look down at the bottom of this slide, if you do this right, if you do it methodically, a good self-service tool can translate into org structure changes. It can really help to redefine the way you are managing the legal work coming in and out of the corporate legal function. And the next slide, so you see here, this title is Self-Service Plus, and then we have Self-Service Plus Plus, right, which just really speaks to that heightened level of maturity. If you've arrived at this point with a self-service implementation, you really have an opportunity to reshape the way people are thinking about things like D&I. Look at those career paths and see what changes you can implement there in light of the new way of doing things. And really take advantage. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, to tie this together, if the concept is just sort of a legal demand portal, and then the ultimate goal, or one goal, I should say, would be self-service. So we are now asking for, I need an NDA. Well, that's something we can self-service, and so we can push back to the business to enable them. So we are no longer, sort of a gating mechanism within legal. But all of these slides together sort of suggest how, if you're thinking about the data structure and how you're approaching it, how if the goal would be, if we could fully self-service enable and manage all business and legal risk and enable the business to get there, how are you capturing all the relevant data? And the three slides here show you how you need to start not only thinking about it, but then truly enabling towards, sort of a self-service model and what things you need to consider. This slide in particular sort of starts showing, well, in a much broader scale, if you're trying to create that legal demand portal and enable self-service, you need to think about these other aspects of change management, which cuts across everything. But more importantly, is the data you're capturing now tie into the way you're thinking about career paths and goals for your legal team as they're evolving or they're trying to learn, or you're thinking about your D&I goals, about how you're sort of sourcing that legal service across all service providers. And so as you're looking at the data, how are you measuring where people are going, where data is flowing, what kinds of talent, but also sourcing models do you have? And then in terms of the delivery of it, are you factoring this in or not? I'm not saying you have to, but it's certainly a necessary and important and imperative for everybody to think about from an enterprise perspective, as sort of certainly in the focus in more recent years around outside counsel and how it matters your staff. So how does that play out into, if you're having a legal demand portal that may route work to external providers? So do you have the fields, do you have the data, do you have the information that's truly going to measure and architect that? And so the other pieces here that happy to have conversations either in Q&A or afterwards, but as you're thinking about other success factors here, are you creating a taxonomy or folksonomy? Taxonomy is just, you've got the structure there, but it's built and pre-built into your system, as opposed to something that the users can change on the fly. They may do it by tagging or otherwise, but there are terms that the business uses or legal teams use or other stakeholders that are involved in it but they may want to tag a certain matter so they can find it their way. It may not be the structured way of doing it, but do you need to have that fully structured approach in your architecture completely, or can you allow for this adaptation? Because that's where people are actually going to, from the change management, adopt the system. And so in terms of the interest of time here, really wanted to highlight for everybody in this seminar or webinar that these 3 self-service slides all tie together to tell a story about how you should start thinking about data and how you're going to use it in light of all these related activities.
Okay, so we are at 2:42.
Pretty good, pretty good. We didn't
Yeah.
use data, but we have a couple of closing points that we'll touch on and then open it up for as many questions as people have on any of these topics or anything related. But, you know, from terms of taxonomies or ontologies, and won't try and get into definitions here, but if you think about the taxonomy, think about it in terms of the way you're classifying matters in a matter management system, and how you might be classifying, you know, sort of budgets or timekeepers, name your flavor. And that might be something in a matter management system. It might be a way you're classifying something in a document management system. It's just the data structures you have there. The ontologies are more sort of the relationships between data and starting to think about that in a different way. So I'd encourage you to start reading up on those concepts, because again, back to moving from the silo to sort of the more integrated, aligned approach. Are you thinking about sort of the structure of data in terms of the properties? This is a thing versus this is something that relates to something else that relates to something else. And I encourage you to start thinking about those relationships, because that's where the power of the data comes, less from the individual properties that I know this is an NDA. But it's an NDA for what purpose? What are the other activities that are going on with this entity? Is it something we actually did with that entity or not? And what's the commercial nature of the relationship? Those are all the relationships that get to this little artifact, which is just, it's an NDA. You know, another important piece to think about as you're sort of thinking about data architectures to try and accomplish all these is, how are you aligning your data strategy with business knowledge, with business rules, policies, security, et cetera. You're not going to be operating in a vacuum. And so those points that were raised in some of the slides earlier about security, around knowledge, you know, knowledge management's an underpinning here that comes near and dear to heart. But think about how you're aligning that data strategy with all these other aspects. And more importantly, look at the business context as you're identifying and mapping fields across systems, because ultimately you're delivering business solutions. You're part of legal and functioning on the legal review, but ultimately it ties back into that business context that Christine mentioned at the top. And my final sort of suggestion to everybody here is you really think about that metadata is actually more important than the data itself. As I've suggested, those connections, those relationships, what's the data about the data that plays out in across systems is truly what is going to make that connectivity from those silos to a more sort of holistic way of looking at the way you're managing and delivering legal services. So that's a very quick run through. I'd encourage everybody to read through the slides. There's a lot of meat there, but wanted to take the next 15 minutes to open this up to the audience for any and all questions.
Peter, Christine, that's some phenomenal stuff. I will have to watch the video back again to grasp some of these concepts. But a lot to think about here. We're going to open it up for questions coming in. Question first for Peter, like how granular should you be getting with your data? When interpreting it for KPIs, like for goal setting that you kind of mentioned, and then for, let's say, contract management systems where you're reviewing contracts and different clauses. Is that something like somebody in a legal operations role should be kind of highlighting and chasing down that information, or is it the GC should be kind of setting the tone around that?
It's going to be a mixture of the above. I'd say ultimately, sometimes people don't know what the options that are there. And so from a legal operations perspective, you want to present what the options are and help them understand the art of the possible, if you will. But in terms of how granular you get, we find is, for example, when we do contract lifecycle management implementations, or we're managed servicing, or we're asked to sort of lift and shift all the contracts, extract key business terms, dump them into a searchable archive, and manage the obligations. You go to the legal and business stakeholders, and they start saying, I want these 35 fields extracted from these contracts. And usually we need to sort of push back and start asking people, what do you want to do with that data? And there's no perfect spot, but it's probably closer to 15 than 35. And so as you're starting to think about how granular you want to get, it's like, what are you going to do with the data? Just having the data isn't going to do anything for you. It needs to tell a story. So whether it's a KPI, whether it's a dashboard, and whether you're trying to extract terms out of a contract, why do you want to track it? What are you going to do with it from either the practice of law, the business of law, or just the business? And then that's going to sort of guide you on how granular you want to get. But there's no perfect answer. But I'd say in terms of from a legal operations perspective, I think part of your role is to sort of help, provide insights to general counsel, DGCs, and the legal team about what's possible, because they may not know. They may have very clear business needs, and then the art is for how do you translate those business needs into reality and system design.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Looks like we got a couple of questions coming in the chat box. First one from Inga Rusu. How can we ensure that the data quality, what processes shall be in place for that, for any of the speakers?
I think it's, there are elements in terms of dashboard design that can sort of start identifying outliers. And so as you're starting to think about, it's a great question in terms of, as you're thinking about data and what you're trying to accomplish it, you plan for some data hygiene. Again, you're planning for all these fancy dashboards and reports and actionable information that you can do. But what is important, particularly as you're trying to sort of architect data across systems, is you need to have some intentional thought about how you're going to manage it, and how you're going to maintain it, and how you're going to optimize it. We talked a little bit about sort of contract optimization and templates. That's an example of using data to be smarter about it and tell a story over time. But even just that ability to sort of ensure data quality, look at your e-billing system, the challenges with data quality there. And so as you're trying to architect this, think about how you're architecting systems and reports and metadata about data to sort of validate that you've got good data flowing in, because ultimately good data is going to get you better reporting on the back end.
Perfect. Great answer. Great question as well, Inga. Mike Russell is the next question. He says, +1, Peter, totally agree on the importance of field mapping and having a well-documented data dictionary. Question, what are your suggestions on tools, techniques for task analysis beyond UTBMS/leads coding, text analytics, etc.?
Good to hear from you, Mike. It's been a while. I'd say where I see things going is we've been doing a bunch of work in terms of data intelligence, predictive analytics, of trying to take structured and unstructured data and create sort of our own structure around the data we're looking at. And so, having worked in law firms, having sort of analyzed sort of law firm billing and on the law firm side, and then on the in-house side of managing outside counsel guidelines as well as e-billing systems, I think we all know the state of the art, if that's the right term, for data that's flowing out and being coded today under tasks. Generally, it's all subjective by the timekeeper. I don't know that there is a true sort of finely filtered view and cleansed up data. There are people who are doing that in law firms and also doing that in-house. But as you're starting to think about that, I've always looked at those additional task coding as helpful, but not dispositive. And so you should start thinking about, as you are looking at trying to classify matters or information from your external providers, call it law firms in one instance, are you requiring your own set of codes? When I managed it in a law firm, and Christine, you did this with me too, there are a lot of companies that came out and said, this is the way we want you to classify our tasks and our matters. We don't want the standard debt codes, we want our custom codes. And so I'd say that the short answer is I would think about custom codes. Longer term, I think about there's definitely technology in play now that will be enhancing over time to sort of tell a better story and reclassify things based on all the emails, all the documents, et cetera, as well as the time entries and the phase task code to sort of tell a more intentional story.
Okay, great question, Mike. Great answer, Peter. Valerie came on with the next question. She's like, great presentation. Thank you. What has been an example of a truly useful data relationship that made a difference in your practice and business management? What has been the biggest waste of time, or at least helpful in trying to optimize operations?
So I'd say the most useful thing that I ever did with data was I had a license. This was in a law firm. I had a license of Tableau, and I took all the time entries for the employment law practice, and I ran some keyword searches on them and I ignored all the phase task coding that was done. And I was trying to convey that certain work was being done by the wrong timekeeper at the wrong cost, having senior associates review complaints. And so I was able to do that through time entry. And so again, I'd say that made a big difference because that immediately was mandated a change that all employment matters of a certain type were going to be phase task code filled, regardless of whether the client wanted it. Again, ignoring how good the task codes were. And so I'd say, again, it's what data do you have at disposal? What tools do you have at your disposal? And it may be in this case, e-billing, that's an easy one because there's a lot of data that people are familiar with. So I'll lean towards that one to sort of say, what do you have that is truly going to change a story about the way you conduct your work? And back to tying some of these threads together, if I'm looking at unit cost, I want to understand the nature of the work that's being done, who's doing it, and what's the cost of that. In that case, it was a senior attorney, and it didn't make any sense to be doing it. It was the wrong typer for the wrong cost at the wrong time. And so do you have any data that can help you tell that story? And the biggest waste of time, I can't say all of them, but a lot of the dashboards that I see that are touted in many systems, they're not actionable. They tell a pretty picture, but they're not actionable. So I'm not calling out any particular vendor, any particular design. They have, give me a pie chart, an intentional pie chart, an intentional stacked bar chart. It can tell a really good story, but how often is that going to be delivered to a general counsel or a CFO and truly change something? And if it's not, why are you doing
it? That's a great answer. It looks like Cindy was writing a question there. Christine, a question for you. Like, have you experienced like, Peter just alluded it to there, just talked about it, where you're pulling from different systems, like contract management systems, like you mentioned earlier, you're pulling from a matter management, and then you're using this dashboard. It's like, I see these they're popping up everywhere right now, but as Peter said, like, I haven't found any actionable really insights from just pulling from Salesforce, pulling from them. It's just like you can, have you seen any positive examples where people have used those successfully?
I think that it's tough, particularly when you're pulling from disparate systems into one and trying to generate any sort of meaningful or actionable data. I think the one thing that I would be inclined to add to Peter's last comment is really, you can do the best job at architecting your data strategy. You can have the most meaningful data being pulled out of systems that are doing an awesome job of talking to one another. But if you don't have, one or more resources kind of dedicated to translating that data, right? To like taking it, consuming it, and pushing it back out in actionable terms, then you're going to be exactly where you started. So I did just want to make that point. I think that, to address the question that you just posed, Colin, I think that there's a lot of work still to be done in terms of, taking data from different tools, integrating it in a way that's really meaningful and actionable without a whole lot of extra work that very few people have time to do at this point.
And that's a huge point that's worth re-emphasizing. We're all talking data, technology, AI, for lack of better terms. It's there to help people and augment. You want to tell a story, and ideally somebody could look at a dashboard and know what they want to do. But a lot of the art that legal operations professionals have, Christine has done this over the years. I know a lot of people on this call have done it. But ultimately, if it's a general counsel or somebody, you can say, here's the data, but here are the actions. Here's how I translate it. And so, you can have all the automated systems you want, all the automated data architecture, data enabled strategies of how you're doing it. Ultimately, somebody's got to look at it, unless you're roboting it.
It goes back to the pyramid, right?
It goes back to the pyramid. Who's that person down there that's gonna do it? And so if you have a system that's going to track it and structure it, but nobody can do anything with it, you built a nice, pretty picture. And so that people piece is critical. It's back to in a way that how are you having that data hygiene behind the scenes? The system can do it, but ultimately somebody's got to look at it and make the call until we hit the singularity in 2029.
Katie just added lots of input in QC. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. That's been my experience as well. It looks like, guys, this looks like the top of the hour. I want to loop it up and just first of all, I want to thank all the attendees for coming today. It's
thank you
for giving us an hour of your time. Really, really appreciate it. We hope we're adding value to bring in experts like Christine and Peter here today to run through just an amazing presentation. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate Christine and Peter for bringing it today, sharing your wisdom. And I want a huge thank you to EY Law, who's the big boys have come out to play. We're delighted to be collaborating with you, and thanks again for everybody. Just a quick follow-up. I will be following up with the slide deck and the recording in the next 24 hours.
Thank you all, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions after looking at all the materials, and have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.